We continue the 6th chapter of the 7th part. Some one of his disciples said to him, "Now you are speaking in frankness, and not speaking a proverb. Now we know that you know all things, and have no need that anyone should ask you. By this we believe that you come forth from God," which is not the same thing as saying that he is God, or a literal son of God. Jesus answered, "Now do you believe? Behold, the hour is coming, and the hour has come, that you shall be scattered, everyone to his own, and shall leave me alone. And I am not alone, because the Father is with me. These things have I spoken to you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you have anguish, but be courageous. I have conquered the world." Then Jesus lifted up his eyes and prayed audibly, while the disciples must have listened in perplexity and awe. And this is the prayer as John records it. "O Father, the hour is come, glorify thy Son, that thy Son may glorify thee, as thou hast given him power over all flesh, that he should give perpetual life to every one whom thou hast given him. And this is the perpetual life, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. I have glorified thee on earth. I have finished the work which thou gavest me to do, and now glorify thou me, O Father, with thyself, by the glory which I have with thee before the world was. I have shown thy name to the men whom thou gavest me out of the world. They were thine, and thou gavest them to me, and they have kept thy word. Now they know that all things, whatever thou hast given me, are from thee. For I have given them the words thou gavest me, and they have received me, and have known surely that I came out from thee. And they have believed that thou didst send me." Avatar, Rasulullah, Apostle, whatever phrase you're going to put on it. I pray for them. For the world I pray not, but for those whom thou hast given me, for they are thine. And thou hast given them to me, and I am glorified in them. And I am no longer in the world, and these are in the world, and I am coming to thee. O Holy Father, keep them in thy name, whom thou hast given me, that they may be one as we. When I was with them, I kept them in thy name, and guarded them, and not one of them is lost, except the son of perdition, that the scripture might be fulfilled. And now I am coming to thee, and these things I am speaking in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. I have given them thy word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. I do not pray that thou wouldst take them out of the world, but that thou wouldst keep them from evil. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. Make them holy in the truth. Thy word is truth. As thou hast sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world. And for their sakes I make myself holy, that they also may be made holy in the truth. But not for these alone do I pray, but for those also who believe on me through their word, that they all may be one, even as thou art in me, and I in thee, that they may also be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me, and the glory which thou hast given me I have given them, that they may be one, even as we, I in them, and thou in me, and that they may be perfect in one, and that the world may know that thou didst send me, and hast loved them, and thou hast loved me. O Father, that which thou hast given me, I will, that where I am, they also may be with me, that they may behold my glory, which thou hast given me. For thou lovedst me before the foundation of the world. O righteous Father, the world also has not known thee, but I have known thee, and these have known that thou didst send me. Thy name I both have made known to them, and will make it known, that the love wherewith thou hast loved them may be in them, and I in them. And Gethsemane here. Perhaps. At the close of this prayer, they sang another portion of the great Hallel. Then they went to the Mount of Olives, crossing the brook Kedron, the name signifying muddy brook. It was probably through what is called St. Stephen's Gate that Jesus and his band passed down and crossed the Kedron, which runs about 200 feet from the city walls. On the slope of the Mount of Olives, which rises herefrom and near the road leading on to Bethany, was the Garden of Gethsemane, meaning an oil press. The garden having derived its name most probably from an oil press which belonged to the estate. Whether we now know the precise spot where Jesus was in agony and where he was betrayed, or is somewhat uncertain. Kidron Valley from Akeldama, but it is quite certain that it could not have been far from the plot where the Latin Church has recently bought and enclosed. We cannot say that the 8 venerable trees, which are so impressive to all travelers, were standing in the days of Jesus. It is probable that they were not, as Josephus informs us, that Titus cut down all the trees round about Jerusalem, and that the 10th legion was posted about the Mount of Olives. 5, 2, and 3, 6, 2, and 8. But these trees must have been planted very early by the hands of those who, cherishing the memory of Jesus, desired to mark the traditionary spot. Dr. Thompson is inclined to place the garden in the secluded vale several hundred yards to the northeast of the present Gethsemane. In any case, it was near the city, and Judas and the other disciples knew that Jesus was accustomed to frequent it for private devotion. Having entered Gethsemane, a great heaviness fell on him, and he said to his disciples, "Sit down and pray, that you do not enter into temptation, while I go and pray yonder." He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John. They walked farther into the garden. He began to be sorrowful and terrified and depressed. They must have perceived it, but he opened his heart to these friends and said, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. Remain here and watch with me." It seemed to be a sense of abandonment coming upon him. Nameless contrarieties of sensation overwhelmed him, and choked and strained his heart, as if they would have stifled and killed him. His appeal to 3 friends is very pathetic. He went a little farther from the 3 disciples, about a stone's throw. He had probably, as Dean Alford conjectures, gone with his 3 friends into a portion of the garden from which the moonlight would be excluded by the rocks and buildings on the opposite side of the gorge. It was the vernal equinox. Well, not in April. And this must have been near midnight. So the moon, being 2 days from its full, would have been able to cast shadows thus. As his anguish deepened, he went into the deepest gloom of the garden. He kneeled down, he fell upon his face and prayed. His prayer was, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as thou wilt. How long he thus agonized we cannot know, but he must have had some comfort from his prayer, for after some time he returned to the 3 disciples and found them all asleep. The travel and excitement of the day had proved too much for them. They certainly did not comprehend the crisis which had come in the affairs of Jesus. He addressed Peter with the intensely pathetic appeal, What could you not watch with me in 1 hour? Rise, watch and pray, that you do not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. He left his poor, heavy-eyed, and exhausted friends, and went back and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this may not pass away except I drink it, thy will be done. He came the second time to his disciples and found them all asleep. Down on his soul fell a great horror of desertion. It was past the midnight. Over the hill in Bethany, Lazarus and Martha and Mary, and perhaps his own mother, for she was at the feast, were sleeping. In front lay Jerusalem, the moon smiling, the moon sailing on above and beyond the city, whose walls on this side grew darker from top to bottom, and within those walls they were plotting to destroy him without fair trial. Judas had left him on an errand that was to be disastrous. Here lay Peter, James, and John asleep near his scene of unspeakable anguish. There lay the other 8 asleep also. His country was under the Roman, whose garrison filled yonder tower of Antonia. The church was arrayed against him. His mother was away, and Mary Magdalene, his true friend. He was not. He was alone. He staggered back and fell upon the ground, and the 3rd time he prayed this prayer of exquisite pain and perfect submission. That's what the word Islam means, by the way, is submission, surrender, but not in terms of defeat. The religious use of the term is not in... Anyways, the horror of his position lay heavily on him. In his agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was, as it were, clots of blood falling down to the ground. His friends afterward believed that an angel appeared to him and gave him succor, and that he was strengthened and his serenity in some measure restored, appears from the tone of his address to his disciples, and by his whole bearing in what immediately followed. He said, Do you sleep on now and rest? Then he suddenly said, It is enough. Behold, the hour is here, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. See that he betrays me is here. And while he was speaking these words, Judas, who knew the place and knew that it was a resort of Jesus and his disciples, probably having sought him in vain in the chamber where he had left him, came upon the party. He was accompanied by a band of men whom they had received from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were not all Roman soldiers, but some were servants of the priests and some were members of the Sanhedrim. They had no official authority to do as they did. They were the minions of the church party. This brings us to an examination of what a learned Jewish physician, M. Salvador of Paris, pronounces the most memorable trial in all history. This writer produced a work entitled The Institutions of Moses and the Hebrew People. At his own request, M. Dupin, the elder, a French lawyer of distinction, reviewed the chapter on the trial and condemnation of Jesus. We shall be indebted to both works, and we make this general acknowledgement to save specific references. Candor ought to compel any Christian writer to admit that it was not a question of a deicide, a name invented to represent an impossible sin, as the church party did not believe that Jesus was a god in any sense. The simple question is, did he receive justice as a Hebrew citizen under Hebrew law? Well, if you're going to, it doesn't matter what you believe, if something is something, but yeah, you can't kill a god. The Mosaic law provided 3 securities for justice in a criminal proceeding, namely publicity of the trial, entire liberty of defense for the accused, and safeguards against false testimony. For the latter, there must be at least 2 witnesses. According to the Hebrew text, 1 witness is no witness. Testimony was rendered under oath. If a witness against the accused perjured himself, he was compelled to undergo the punishment which would have befallen the accused if he had been convicted. And there's where we look into the whole death penalty thing as a side note to that, right? I mean, the Bible has too many death penalties, I think, but if the accused were convicted, the witnesses by whose evidence he perished dealt the first blow in proof of the truth of their testimony. A woman should not be a witness because she might not have the courage to deal such a blow. In the Islamic vision, that's not true at all. If anything, you can say Surah 2 grants women a provision that men are not granted. It doesn't say that a woman's testimony is equal to that of 2 men, you know. But yeah, the biblical position that the woman can't testify, the woman can't speak in church, the woman, so who are they to talk about how other faiths treat women? No man could testify against himself. The testimony was required to be exceedingly specific. The very hour, as well as day, place, and circumstances must be mentioned. There were 23 judges. Well, if you look at the Aramaic alphabet, right, one of the things, or Aramea really is how it's pronounced, but there were 22 to 30 letters depending on the script. Now, the most necessary, aside from the 22, is the split of the Ain and Ra. That's the most meaningful. Okay, let's have a second letter. And it's also interesting to note that Arabic has 30 sounds itself. So, those who believed the accused to be innocent spoke first. Those who believed him guilty spoke afterwards, and with the greatest moderation, the most profound attention was given to the accused when he wished to speak. Of the 23 votes, 11 would acquit, while it required 13 to condemn. If acquitted, the accused was discharged instantly. If condemned, the sentence was not pronounced until the 3rd day. On the 3rd day, any judge who had been in favor of condemning might change his vote as to acquit, but one who had once voted for acquittal could not change his vote so as to condemn. If then at least 13 judges voted for condemnation, the prisoner was led forth slowly. The judges remained on the bench. An officer was stationed at the door with a flag, while another on horseback accompanied the prisoner, looking back constantly as he would be recalled by the waving of the flag if any testimony in favor had been brought before the judges. On his own declaration that he recalled some reasons which had escaped him, the prisoner could be brought back to the judges as often as 5 times. As the procession advanced slowly, a herald with a loud voice proclaimed, "This man," stating his name and surname, is led to punishment for," here the crime was named, "the witnesses who have sworn against him are," here their names are recited. "If anyone has evidence in favor, let him come forth and give it quickly." There is an epitome of M. Salvador's representation of the administration of criminal law among the Hebrews. We shall now see whether Jesus had a fair trial. We may recall that, before tampering with Judas, the church party had determined that Jesus should die, thus pronouncing sentence upon him for any beginning of even a show of trial. Then they had appointed emissaries, employing evil men, for none but wicked men, feigning themselves to be good, could be engaged in such a work, to dog the steps of Jesus and entangle him in his talk. There was nothing done by Jesus which anyone was willing to lay voluntarily before the authorities and denounce as a crime against God or social order. Well, if something's socially inappropriate, if that's all really that you have, yeah, that should stay out of the courts, right? So far from this, they arrested him before any allegation was made. And they did this craftily and stealthily, so that the people might not know. They desired to postpone the arrest until the termination of the Passover should have emptied the city of the multitudes from all parts of the country who had heard and seen Jesus, not one of whom had accused him of any crime, and many of whom might have given testimony in his favor. When circumstances hurried up the operations of Judas, they seized Jesus, rushing him through a mock trial, and crucified him in the space of less than 10 hours. We shall examine each point in the presence of this affair in the light of the Hebrew law as stated by M. Salvador, a learned defender of his ancestors and their actions in the case of Jesus. Now, there's a lot of talk about Jews being descended from the Hebrews, which is usually not true. We've converts to Christianity, people, Slavic people, German people, Turkish people, but not so much, actual Semites. And they've done genetic studies that have shown as much as 95% no noted Semitic ancestry, and I'm talking like, in the past 3,000 years or something like that. But wherever Christianity spread, you ended up with Judaism. So, in the first place, it was unjust to begin to prosecute, not to say persecute, him before any charges had been laid before the Grand Council. In the next place, it was a gross irregularity to attempt to take him privately and not give him the benefit of all the publicity of a most open trial in clear daylight and not in the night. This was enhanced by employing a spy and bribing him to assist in their unlawful procedure. They go about to take him without any regular and legal Roman or Jewish order for his arrest. The Sanhedrin had a conclave, but not a regular sitting. It did not proceed as a court of law, but rather as a band of conspirators. They took counsel how they might slay him, as John 11:53 says, not how they might administer justice in his case. And I think that we should see how the whole procedure was the execution of a foregone conclusion, and was the condemnation of a man before trial. The signal of Judas was a kiss. He was not to lay hands on his master, nor join this mob in their attack. He was simply to designate Jesus, and this was the preconcerted sign, the selection of which perhaps intimates that Jesus was accustomed to receive this affectionate mode of salutation from his apostles. When they had been separated for a season, Judas approached him and said, so as to be heard by the band, "Hail, Rabbi," and kissed him. The reply of Jesus was most mild, and to Judas must have been painfully cutting. Matthew repeats it as, "Friend, for what are you here?" Luke says that Jesus said, "Do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" And his manner of narrating it might imply that Jesus prevented the kiss by the question. But Matthew and Mark distinctly affirm that Judas actually kissed Jesus, all the historians showing that Jesus knew the intent of this salutation. Upon this, Jesus stepped forward to the crowd and said, "Whom do you seek?" They replied, "Jesus the Nazarene." He answered, "I am he." what there was of majesty, innocence, and spiritual power in his presence. In reply, we may conjecture from the facts that though they were all armed, and were many coming out against a man whose friends were few and unprepared for conflict, they staggered backwards and fell to the ground. Here was a man capable of inspiring such awe, and yet never voluntarily, so far as we can perceive, putting forth any influences to serve or save himself. He stood alone in that garden, in the broad light of the full Paschal moon, and the band of conspirators and ruffians who had come to take him lay prone on the ground. He recalls them by asking a second time, "Whom seek ye?" And they made the same reply as before. "Jesus, the Nazarene." He said to them, "I have told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go away," so that his disciples might not suffer with him. They then advanced to seize him, and his disciples, perceiving what would follow, said, "Lord, shall we smite with the sword?" The impetuous Peter did not wait for a reply, but immediately made a blow at the nearest man, who happened to be one Malchus, a servant of the high priest, and cut off his right ear. M. Dupin argues the fact that Peter was not arrested, either at this moment or afterwards, when he was recognized by a relative of Malchus at the house of the high priest, is proof that this was an illegal seizure. Otherwise, Peter's resistance would have been an act of rebellion by an armed force against a judicial order. Jesus healed the priest's servant with a touch. He also restrained his disciple, who, under the awe which the presence of Jesus inspired in his persecutors, might have perhaps delivered him. He said to Peter, "Return your sword to its place, for all who take the sword shall perish by the sword. Do you think that I am not able to pray unto my Father, and he shall forthwith give me more than 12 legions of angels? But how, then, should the scripture be fulfilled, that thus it must be, the cup which my Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" He did not, however, forbear to let the multitude understand that he knew the illegality of what they were doing. "Have you come out against a thief with swords and clubs to take me? I sat daily teaching in the temple, and ye laid no hold upon me. But this is the hour and the power of darkness. All this has come to pass that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." And it was a distinct intimation to the mob that he was suffering voluntarily, and quite as distinctly an intimation to his disciples that he was going to suffer certainly. So they understood it, and forsook him, and fled. And one of the things that we see in the Savior myths, particularly, is the willing going to the battlefield or otherwise where the person is killed. And then over time they divinized the whole thing. But it comes into the stories of others who were not divinized heroes in one way or another, that they list them as willingly approaching what would probably kill them and fulfilling prophecies that were laid forth before. Section 4 of the trial. Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews laid hands on Jesus and bound him and led him away. This was another outrage. He was alone and unarmed. Friday morning, April 6th, 30 of the Common Era, in this placement theory, you could call it, I guess. He was alone and unarmed. He offered no resistance to his captors, but had come forward and surrendered himself voluntarily, and yet they treated him as a condemned malefactor, or resisting culprit. And this is a map of Jerusalem. I'm going to get good detail with that. The hill of offense. The evil counsel. Yeah, the hill of evil counsels. Like why that? Well, that's a modern map to some degree, isn't it? No, I think maybe they're taking some modern stuff out of that. They took Jesus to the house of Annas. Annas had been high priest. He was first appointed to that office about the year 7 of the Common Era by Quirinius, uh, by Quirinius, proconsul of Syria, but was deposed by Valerius Gratus, procurator of Judea, about 7 years later, who gave the office to Ismail, then to Eleazar, the son of Anas, who held it only a year. Was succeeded by Simon, who held it another year, and then it fell into the hands of Caiaphas, the son-in-law of Annas. Annas had not been high priest for nearly 20 years, but as father-in-law of the actual high priest and his second or substitute, and having held the office himself, he exerted great influence. Nevertheless, the carrying of Jesus to Annas was a vexation and irregular procedure, contrary to the spirit of the Hebrew law, as subjecting a man before any trial or condemnation to an insulting inspection. Annas had no right to question Jesus. He was not the proper person to deal with the case. He had no jurisdiction. If he had, it was not lawful to put a man in a position to condemn himself. Indeed, according to Jewish law, his own words could not be used against himself, so that any catechizing of Jesus in regard to his disciples and his doctrines was unlawful. It was a compliment to Annas, but an insult to Jesus as a citizen, to be carried forward to gratify the curiosity of this bad old man, who was one of the conspirators against the life of the prisoner. There was an opportunity now to do Jesus simple justice. If Annas had been right-minded, he would have taken Jesus into his house, and even if under guard, have kept him until daylight. His great personal influence, his relations with the high priest, who had married his daughter, and with the Sanhedrin, would have justified Annas herein. Instead of which, he aided and abetted those lawless men in their persecution of Jesus. He sent him bound in the night to the place of Caiaphas. This place must have been near the chamber in which the Sanhedrin held its sessions. The night was wearing away. It was growing so cold that while the Sanhedrin was being unlawfully assembled, for it could not meet at night or on the Sabbath, they made a fire until the council could be gathered. Caiaphas seems to have taken upon himself the catechizing of Jesus, which he had no right to do personally, but only in his place as president of the Sanhedrin. He asked him of his doctrines and his disciples with evident malice of intent to criminate the prisoner and inculpate his friends. His dignified reply was, I spoke openly to the world. I, at all times, taught in the synagogue and in the temple, where all the Jews resort, and I have said nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who heard me, what I said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. Here he threw himself upon the great reserved Hebrew rights, freedom of speech, and being confronted by one's accusers. Caiaphas must have felt that his proceeding was at least irregular. If he had been conducting a trial, he should have called for witnesses. The reply of Jesus was just what any Hebrew would naturally give under the circumstances, provided he had intelligence enough to know and courage enough to assert his rights. But one of the ecclesiastical officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand and said, Do you answer the high priest so? The reply of Jesus is full of indescribable dignity and forbearance. If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why do you smite me? Here is another speech which shows that Jesus knew his rights and was aware that they were invaded. The man who struck him might have borne testimony against him if they were both together in a court having jurisdiction, but if he did not appear as a witness, he had no right to insult him by striking him when he was bound. This was an additional outrage which the high priest permitted to be perpetrated, it accumulates the proof that Jesus never had a fair trial as a citizen when another high priest commanded those who stood by Paul when he was up for a hearing to smite him on the mouth. The intrepid apostle answered, God shall smite you, you whited wall. For do you sit to judge me after the laws and command me to be smitten contrary to the law? Acts 23 verse 3. All this persecution of Jesus is to be noticed took place in the night contrary to law, which demanded daylight and utmost publicity. In the meantime, Peter began to recover his self-possession. He desired to learn what was happening to his master, and so went to the palace of Caiaphas and lingered outside. He was joined by another disciple, John 18:15, whose name is not given. It has been assumed to be John. There seems a little ground for the presumption. We can only speculate. The probabilities are that it was Judas. Whoever that other disciple was, he was known to the high priest. There is no reason to believe that John was, while we know that very weak Judas had been with the dignitary, making arrangements for the betrayal of Jesus. This will also account for the freedom with which he entered the palace of the high priest, and the interest he could make for the admission of Peter. John would have been in almost as much danger as Peter, as he was generally as prominent in the group about the teacher. On the supposition that this other disciple was Judas, the whole history becomes easy. Peter might have been admitted on the supposition that he was an accomplice with Judas in the delivery of Jesus. On any of the theories which have been advanced on his character and motives, it was natural that Judas, in his excitement, should follow Jesus into the palace of the high priest to see the result, and would be relieved by the presence of another disciple. However that may have been, Peter entered. In the court of the palace, the slaves and officers had made a fire. Instead of warming themselves, Peter went up to the fire and warmed himself with them. It may be that the maid who kept the door began to fear that she was admitting strangers too freely, or she may have seen the look of concern on the face of Peter. She went up to him and said, And are you not one of this man's disciples? He denied it before them all, saying, I am not. I do not know him, nor do I understand what you are saying. This peremptory challenge disconcerted Peter, and he walked out into the court. Perhaps he put on the air of a man insulted before a company. But an excitement had been begun by his presence. Another maidservant, probably passing him in the court and coming up to the fire, stated her belief that the uneasy man out there was a disciple of Jesus, while Peter was out in the courtyard. The cock crew, but it does not seem to have recalled the prediction of Jesus. Upon his return to the fire, the whisper went round, This fellow was also with Jesus the Nazarene, until one boldly blurted out the charge, and still another directly put the question to him, Are you not one of his disciples? He made a second distinct denial, backing up with some profane expression, and exerting that he did not know the man. These denials seem to have occurred while the high priest was examining Jesus. There was an interval of an hour which was spent in assembling the Sanhedrim and in inducing men to become witnesses. It was cold. Jesus was in the hall inside, which opened probably on the court where Peter and his servants and officers were. The embarrassing examinations to which Peter had been subjected began to be painful. He must have recollected the prominent part he had taken in the affair of Gethsemane. He endeavored to throw suspicion from himself by engaging in free conversation with the others, as being no more personally interested in what was going forward than they were, but it did not succeed. His very garrulousness aroused suspicion. One said, Of a truth this man was with him, for he is a Galilean. His speech betrays him. Jesus was the Galilee. The Galileans were a turbulent race. Most of the disciples of Jesus were known to be Galileans. Their dialect was not that of cultivated Jews, nor even of the uncultivated inhabitants of the metropolis. So they made his accentuation a perf against him.